Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Cultivating Compassion Education series presented by Compassionate Care ALS. We're very fortunate tonight to have with us our trauma and spiritual care liaison for Compassionate Care ALS, Julie Brown Yau, PhD. Dr. Yau is an expert in the field of healing complex trauma. She specializes in the resolution of relational, complex, and intergenerational trauma. She is a master NeuroAffective Relational Model practitioner and an authorized teacher of the Shri Vidya tradition. Using a unified approach, Julie's work addresses the challenging psychological dynamics of trauma and includes the latest neuroscientific findings, contemplative and somatic psychologies. Julie supports those living with ALS in many ways and has been a part of our program for a long time and has done so much good in our work. And so we're very grateful to have Julie with us tonight. Before she begins, I'd like to turn it over to Ron Hoffman, our founder, to say a few words. Welcome, Ron.
Yeah, thank you, James. Thank you all for being here. It's rather eclectic group of folks, so thank you. I met Julie 20 years ago, and as we got to know each other, I started learning more and more about her work. And, you know, as the years went by, I realized early in my career, one of the things that I was incredibly curious about is when someone is diagnosed with something like ALS, just how incredibly traumatic that experience is. And what I noticed is that there's no support for that. I mean, it made me incredibly curious. Here's someone receiving such a diagnosis, and they're pretty much left to their own devices. So early in my career, I said, there needs to be a different way. And so as Julie and I got to know one another, she started getting involved with the organization. She was instrumental in creating the Cultivating Compassion education series, which we have a wonderful CD, which we'll introduce down the road to all of you. We've got many available. It's a group of meditations and practices. And again, as the years went by, Julie started working with more and more of our families. And her support, I have found, and many have found, to be invaluable in one's navigating all the complexities of living with ALS. You know, the big piece is, you know, from my perspective, we all have some woundedness within us, some trauma. And beyond the diagnosis of ALS, what I have found, there's so much more that starts coming to the surface, not just for the individual living with ALS, the individual diagnosed, but also the caregivers, the husbands, wives, partners, because it's complex. And I'm just grateful for our relationship with Julie and the work that she does with many of our families. She will be discussing her wonderful workbook as well, and a program that we have, and James will speak to that as well going forward. So all of that said, thank you all for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Julie. Julie, thank you for being here and doing this.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone at CCALS, for the invitation to be here, to be able to talk about trauma and the ALS journey. The body of work of trauma is so extensive. So tonight, what I'm going to speak to is the definition of trauma. I'm going to differentiate two types of trauma so we understand it better. And I want to mention now that what Compassionate Care is offering after this talk this evening is an ongoing book club where we're going to be working with my workbook, in which there's a lot of exercises, a lot of explanations about trauma. So what we don't cover tonight, which of course we can, with our time, we can only cover a little bit, there's going to be a way that we can work together ongoing, using the workbook, meeting again and going deeper into the questions that may arise when we begin to do practices to help us heal the trauma that you may be suffering with. Right? Trauma is always about disconnection, and healing trauma is about reconnecting. So in trauma, we can disconnect from our bodies, from our emotions, from our feelings. We can disconnect from ourselves, from others in the world around us. And so when we resolve trauma, we reconnect to ourselves, to others, to our emotions, to our body, and so forth. But it's complex to do so. And to do so, we have to understand what type of trauma we are suffering with. And so that's what I'm going to talk about in a little while. But before I do so, I would like to offer a reflective exercise. So I'm just going to pose a question in a moment. And the idea is just to simply close your eyes if you like and reflect what happens, possibly in your body. So really noticing your bodily experience, right, as I pose the question, and just observe. And one of the reasons I'm offering this is because to resolve trauma, we really need to grow and expand and deepen our capacity of self-observation. So this is a beginning practice of this. There's no way to get this wrong, right? Just listen, see what your experience is. And after the first question, I'm going to ask another one, which is probably going to feel a little bit more pleasant, okay? So center yourself within yourself, whatever that means to you. Just coming back to yourself, maybe noticing your breath a little bit, noticing the chair that you're sitting in, feeling the chair support you, and just being with yourself for a moment. And here's a self-reflective question. Think about or reflect on the last time you felt disconnected. Just keep it simple. Don't go to the deepest ever disconnection experience you had. Just reflecting on the last time you felt disconnected. And just simply be curious about your experience. Beautiful. And then the second part, and just again, really observing the difference. Reflect upon a time when you felt connected, whatever that means to you. And if you can, really be aware of your bodily experience, the time when you felt connected. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. And then just notice your experience right now after you've thought about something that felt connecting, and see if something feels a little bit easier, a little bit more open. So, trauma is always about disconnection. There's two types of trauma that's really important to understand. Now, the word trauma we're hearing in the world a lot today. And there's shock trauma or acute trauma, which I'm going to describe in a moment, which is really important to know. And then there is early trauma, also known as developmental trauma, childhood trauma, attachment trauma. So different names for trauma that occurs in childhood, slight variations in the descriptions if I was to define them. But here are two types of trauma that I'm going to speak about. And the reason it's good to understand or to know the difference is because the symptoms of both traumas often look the same. but they need to be met and treated, if you will, differently. So if somebody has a shock trauma, which I'll describe in a moment, and gets, or maybe I'll put it another way. If somebody has a developmental trauma and the therapist is treating the symptoms as if it was a shock trauma, you're going to get a little bit into trouble. And I'll explain why in a moment. So a shock trauma is usually something that happens too quick, too fast, that our system, our nervous system, our mind can't assimilate what's happening, right? And because we can't assimilate what's happening, we feel very overwhelmed. Could be emotional overwhelm, just a fright, overwhelm, fear, overwhelm. And what we tend to do then is disconnect from ourselves to varying degrees. We disconnect from our emotion, we disconnect from our body, we can even disconnect from ourselves. And until that shock trauma is resolved, we tend to stay disconnected. I'm going to give you an example of a shock trauma. This happened to me just a couple of weeks ago. Never had this experience before. And I was so fortunate to know how to resolve it right afterwards. Okay. And then I'll speak more to shock trauma with ALS. So I was about to take my dog for a walk. I took about 4 steps into the street. And right in front of me, I saw this aggressive dog coming up the street towards me like a bullet. And this is the dog that is tied down in its own home. It's so aggressive. I didn't have time to think, which often we don't in a shock trauma, right? It happens really quickly. So my body reacted, and I did what apparently you're not meant to do if a dog's running after you. I picked my dog up and I swung it out the way, and this aggressive dog just went right by us. My body, so not my intellect, my body perceived such a threat. I had a picture in my mind of my dog or myself, or both of us being bitten. None of us were, by the way. It's all a good ending. But my body perceived a great amount of danger and no way to escape. And I literally disconnected. And I lost moments in time. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on the ground, came to, my dog was beside me, and my body started to shake a little bit. The dog had been grabbed by its owner, and then the other owner was standing over me, making sure I was okay, saying, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" Trying to calm me down because my body was shaking because I just had a shock trauma, right? A quick, sudden, wasn't an impact, but it was a big fright that I couldn't assimilate. It happened so quickly. And I told them, I said, just leave me alone a second, let my body shake, let my body do some big deep breaths. And I eventually reconnected to myself because I know how to do it. And then when I felt ready, I walked into my home, I called a friend, I connected with a friend, right? My body settled even more until we laughed a little bit. And then that trauma, potential trauma, didn't embed in my system because I was able to work with it right after. So it was a potential trauma. Trauma isn't the actual event that's happening. You know, the trauma wasn't the dog running at me. The trauma would have been the response in my body. Fortunately, it didn't stay in my body. I knew how to work it through. I let my body shake. I took deep breaths. I connected with someone until everything settled. No trauma embedded in my system. Even though I disconnected, I was able to come back. Okay. Something similar in a shock trauma could be a car accident, a fall, right? We don't have time to know what's happening. And most people don't know how to resolve that shock and that impact, right? And so they stay somewhat disconnected. Another shock trauma can be a diagnosis of ALS. Now, depending upon your history of trauma is how your nervous system may respond. It's always going to be frightening. It's always going to be a shock. Even if there's been months of suspicion maybe leading up to it, it's still a big fright. And if we don't address that big fright of the diagnosis for the person who may have ALS or for the family members, loved ones, friends, etc., we may still remain a little bit disconnected from the emotional impact, from the impact in our nervous system. And so right from the beginning of the diagnosis, there can be disconnection that really leaves us at more risk for the more frights and the more losses that come up along the way. So we can't go into a short talk on how to actually heal that kind of a shock trauma. But I do want to mention again in that book club, if you sign up for that, those are the kinds of things we're going to be working with. And also, that's a type of shock that you can read about in my book and begin to work with yourself or another. Okay. Now, the other kind of trauma that's really important to understand is developmental trauma. Again, this is a trauma that happens in childhood. And it's usually not a shock trauma. Now, of course, shock traumas can happen in childhood all of the time. A fall, a loss of a parent, an accident, all kinds of things that happen too quickly to assimilate. And that is separate than developmental trauma. Developmental trauma is things that tend to go on repeatedly over time, like being left alone to cry it out, right? That can be very traumatic for a child because they're not getting their needs met and it feels really scary and it's ongoing, okay? So lots of types of things can happen in our childhood that embed trauma in our system because we're too young to be able to feel the emotions. Right? Now, in trauma, whether it's a shock trauma or an early trauma, all kinds of emotions can come up. When that dog ran at me, what I noticed right after was a huge surge of anger, right? Which I was able, with my capacity, just to let that move through me. You know, I didn't have to get angry at anybody. I could just feel it and then it was gone. But any kind of trauma, all kinds of emotions can come up and they're too much. So we push them down, right? As if we push them down underneath our conscious awareness. Unfortunately, they don't go anywhere, right? They're just out of our view, if you will. But they're affecting our nervous system continuously. So it's important to be able to find where these old traumas are and where these old stuck emotions or hidden emotions are, to find ways to resolve them, to have a healthier nervous system. So on the ALS journey, right, which is, we could say it's a shock trauma in a way, or a potential shock trauma. The other thing that does is brings up developmental trauma. So then not only are you working with the shock of ALS and the profound impact, there's a potential for it to rattle unresolved early developmental traumas that will come up to the surface. So then we have more emotions that feel really challenging to deal with than we may ordinarily have with the intensity of working only with ALS. So a lot of families that I work with, whether it's the person who has ALS or the caregivers or just family members, there tends to be such an intensity of emotions that come up that aren't just fitting for the journey itself, but seem to be much more. And this is because the past gets rattled and comes up, and we have so much more to deal with. Now, something else that comes up that gets entangled with trauma is grief. So we all know the intensity of grief that can come up in the ALS journey, right? There seems to be this continual, or it doesn't seem to be, there is a continual loss of something along the way. Now, grief isn't an emotion that culturally or collectively we've been taught to embrace or even be with. Grief is challenging and it's always painful. But unless we've really developed a capacity to feel well, grief becomes really challenging. And one of the reasons grief is really challenging in adulthood, one, I said, because we're not usually taught how to work with grief when we're children. How many of us may have had a kitten or puppy that died, and rather than being held in the experience of grief and tears as a family, you're told, oh, it's going to be okay, we'll get you another one. It's like we try to replace the grief with something else so we don't have to feel it, because parents themselves are uncomfortable with grief. Are uncomfortable seeing their children in grief. And so we learn to not feel grief. But what happens sometime in our life, all of those unfelt griefs connect underneath our conscious awareness. And then in the ALS journey, there's a potential then when there's so much grief for us to be so scared by it because there's so much unfelt grief from the past. So we have to learn how to work with grief gently. We have to learn how to work with emotions gently. It's really important for us to learn how to develop a capacity to feel more. Because once we start reconnecting to ourselves and working with the emotions that come up, we don't really know the ferocity in which they might come up. We usually don't know what's underneath our conscious awareness. That's why it's often called the unconscious. We don't know how much unfelt material, if you will, of our lives is there. And so we really need to be gentle with ourselves. And so self-reflective questions are a really good way in which we can begin to build a sense of observation, to know what's going on inside us, to not just do a deep dive inside of us. And in the workbook we're going to be working with, there's a lot of exercises that teach us how to gently connect to the body, because trauma lives in our body. And whether you have ALS or a caregiver or a family member or a caretaker, it's really important to begin to build a relationship with your body deeper than you may ordinarily have, right? Because it's our body where we're going to feel emotions. It's our body where we're going to feel grief. And it's our body that we needed to be connected to have all of these resolve, so they're no longer affecting our nervous system in an unhealthy way. As I say, these emotions don't go anywhere. They're always there affecting us. And when we are in more challenging situations, it somehow seems to open the doorway for these emotions to want to come up to be felt. Because all emotions have a sense of needing to be felt, right? They want their moment in time, right? Which their moment in time is to be felt in the body. And when we can feel them, they'll have their time in time, and then they'll leave. But most of us have been taught to not feel emotions, right? From our childhood, right? Anger's not nice, or anger feels bad, or we saw a parent angry. And of course, it's terrifying, so we don't want to feel that, so we push it down. Or sadness felt too much, and so we learned not to feel sad and push that down. We really culturally, across many cultures, weren't taught to be with emotions. And that's been really detrimental to all of our, lives and our well-being. So I'm going to pause for a moment and just ask you to check in with yourselves. So I'm giving you a lot of information, and just simply notice, do you feel connected? Do you feel a little more disconnected? Kind of inquiring about your bodily self, but your whole experience. Now, if you're feeling a little disconnected, or even if you're feeling connected, see if you look around the room a little bit. If you can, move your head. If you can't, feel the back of the chair that you're sitting in, or the bed that you're sitting in. And see if you can feel connected to that. If you are able to move your head, right, what this is doing is presencing you in the moment, right? You look around the room, you notice where you are. It's sending messages to your brain that you're here in this room, in this moment, you're okay. Otherwise, feeling the chair that you're lying on, maybe noticing your breath for a moment. Okay. So coming back to the body for a moment, right? This is where trauma lives. Building a relationship with the body is important, right? Because we have to, but it can also feel like a place we don't want to be. Healing trauma isn't about getting back into the body, right? When we resolve the dynamics of trauma, which can be the fright that we have, the shock that we have, the disconnection that happens, or maybe trauma from childhood of our needs not being met, of not being taught to be with emotions. Okay? When we start to do that, we are undoing the dynamics that are preventing us from wanting to feel the body. And over time, we will gently reconnect. So there's always dynamics underlying trauma, which are the driving force of the symptoms. So symptoms of trauma, right, are emotions that come up and squid out of us and we really don't mean to, and then they go back down. It can be feeling anxiety and a lot of anxiety, and we're not really sure what the anxiety is, or we look out in the world and try and find a reason, and we can usually find one why we're anxious. Or maybe we have repetitive thoughts that we just can't stop, or intrusive thoughts that are really hard to get away from, or insomnia, we can't sleep, panic, just an awful feeling in the gut. So these are just migraines, right? So these are just some of the symptoms of trauma. Okay. And so gently being able to be curious about these symptoms and really exploring ways in which we can see, is this coming from a shock trauma? Is this coming from the early developmental years of my life? Okay. And in the book club, or if you read my book, which is the Body Awareness Workbook for Trauma, we'll speak more about that at the end. It's going to give you ways to help you differentiate, to help understand where this trauma might be coming from. And initially, if you don't know, it's okay, because we're going to go gentle enough and slow enough to be able to work with the symptoms for it to be able to make sense. Now, one of the greatest tools that we have in working with trauma is our imagination. Now, our imagination isn't just being able to visualize, because some people say they don't have a good visual capacity. But actually, usually when we start to do this work, images just show up. But it can be what we sense in our body or what we have an intuition about. So our imagination includes all of that. I'll give you an example of someone who had a really awful time when they received their ALS diagnosis. It came out of the doctor's mouth like a, like a bullet, like that dog running up the street at me, and hit them in such a terrifying and frightening way. They were speechless. They couldn't manage to say anything. And the doctor, unfortunately, didn't recognize the shock that they went into. And they went home, and the shock, yeah, they got their voice back, and yeah, they were able to talk about it, but their body was tense and hypervigilant, for the longest time because of that lack of connection in that interaction and the shock that happened, and no knowledge or understanding of how to come out of that. When we began to work together, I said, well, what would you have liked to have done in that moment when you received that diagnosis? And the person told me. Now, of course, they couldn't do it. We can't go back in time and do it. And at that time, we can't go back into the office and say what they would have liked to have said or done what they would like to have done. But our imagination gives us the capacity to allow our body to feel as if it gets to do that. So this person wanted to shout something quite angrily at the doctor and throw something at them. It's nothing that they would have actually done, but it's our imagination. And it was the first thing that came up. So why not? Because it came out so harshly towards them. So they closed their mind and connected with their body and imagined shouting what they wanted to shout and imagined throwing what they wanted to throw. And it really wasn't about the doctor at that point, right? It's about them and their body healing. And then they reflected inward of how that felt. And of course, the body took some deep breaths, right? Tears started to come from the shock and the grief that they couldn't feel in the moment of that diagnosis. And then some sobbing came, right? As they began to shift some of the energy that was stuck in them from the shock just through imagination, right? And then an important part of we're doing an imaginative exercise to complete, something that you would like to have done but couldn't at the time, is to imagine you get to a place of safety, which is the arms of a loved one, or snuggling your dog, or the arms of an angel, something that is imaginative. And then you imagine that happening to you. And then the body, parts of the brain, don't know what's real and what's not real. This is why it's such a powerful tool. And the body can be able to settle and reconnect, right? Reconnect back to your body even more. So that's just one simple exercise of how we can go back in time, but not really go back in time, to resolve something that happened in the past. Because you see, we carry what's unresolved in our body. So if we can access what feels unresolved through particular questions, through particular inquiries, our body or our psyche or our intellect, our mind will give us answers of what we would like to do. Now we get to do them safely in our imagination. And the nervous system begins to go, okay, I got to protect myself in some kind of way. And now I feel a little bit safer. And when we feel a little bit safer, the heart begins to open a little bit more. And we can feel more connected to ourselves. And we can feel more connected to others. And we can feel more connected to the environment around us. And ultimately, we feel more connected to who we are, more than who we might ordinarily have thought ourselves to be, and find our place in the universe. So in people who go on a journey of really resolving their trauma, it becomes a very spiritual journey in some way, not because we necessarily talk about spirituality, but because they find themselves so connected to more than who they ordinarily thought they were. The grief that we encounter and the emotions that get resolved in the body allow us, as I say, to connect more deeply to ourselves and allow our heart to open more. Now, many of us don't realize that we might be walking around with layers and layers of protection around our heart because of the painful experiences we've had in life. For developmental or early trauma, for instance, right? Every time something painful happens and mom or dad or our caregiver isn't there to soothe and calm us through it, it's like a little barrier goes up in our heart. Because when we're children, we don't have a whole lot of resources to deal with those frightening experiences. Now, of course, we're told children are really resilient. Children are really malleable. Their resilience is putting up barriers against their heart to not feel. But unfortunately, those barriers stay, and it puts a little disconnect from who we truly are and the feelings of the capacity of our heart. So when we come to heal trauma, whether it's shock traumas or developmental trauma, we begin to dissolve these barriers, right, that are protecting our heart from feeling all of these stuck emotions that are inside of us, right? But ultimately, to protect us from feeling love. So another way of describing what trauma does is it closes our heart. Closes our heart because it's too much to feel the pain of whatever that event was that was too much, especially early trauma. And I would say this last 100 years, we've, all of us are probably within that age range. We've all experienced developmental trauma to varying degrees, for sure. We all have experienced it. And I would say all of us have unresolved early trauma. And some of us are aware of it and some of us aren't. But on the journey of healing trauma, we more often than not become aware of it. And the beauty in that is then we become more aware of how we are disconnected from our own heart and our own love, or the love that we actually are. And it's not necessarily an easy journey, but it's a journey that has so many benefits because we're coming back to ourselves, we're coming back to our heart, we're coming back to love and knowing our place in the universe. And that on the ALS journey, especially for those who have ALS, but maybe not especially maybe for all of us, is a beautiful experience to have, because we can fall deeper and deeper into the acceptance of where we are or who we are on this human journey. And I know with working with individuals at end of life with ALS, the surrender, the love, the acceptance that happens has made the transition beautiful in so many ways. And so that's one potential that's there for working with trauma. I'm going to pause and just ask you again to reconnect with yourself. Just notice your experience. A little check-in. Notice your breath. Notice if something's touched you. Notice if you're bored. Notice if you're excited. Notice if you're curious. Okay. So let me just take a peek at my notes. And then I think I'm going to take a couple of questions. Oh, I know what we're going to do before. Before I take some questions, I'm going to ask you all to reconnect again. Notice your experience. So you've just done it. So it's right there. And now I'm going to ask you, if you feel okay, to gently close your eyes and relax your eyeballs. Kind of a strange thing to ask, but relax your eyeballs. And see if you can just allow them to drop back into the sockets. Yeah. Our eyes work so hard. We're always reaching out into the world. So keep relaxing them as I talk. Right? They're always reaching out into the world. And whenever we've had trauma, the eyes actually work really hard because they try and reach to find somebody safe to connect with. And they can get stuck in this hypervigilant mode, right? This sense of needing to connect with something. And then we don't realize that, and they stay really tense. And tense eyes create a slight sense of anxiety in our body. Sometimes it's perceptible, sometimes it's not. When our eyes are relaxed, it sends messages to our brain and nervous system that we're safe, right? And when we feel a little safe, the nervous system, autonomic nervous system, down-regulates a little bit, right? It actually will gently open the heart a little bit at the chest area, and it'll allow us to breathe deeper into the belly. Now keep relaxing your eyes. Now, you might not notice all of this, but if you practice this over time, you will. It's going to be really subtle. Keep your eyes closed. Before you open your eyes, I'm going to say, when you do so, I'm going to ask you to let the world flow into you. So it's as if you're not going to look out your eyes. You're going to let the worlds come to you. So for a couple more seconds, keep relaxing your eyeballs. Maybe relax your brow just a little bit. Try the gentlest smile on your face, just tiny. So you feel your whole face softening. Notice any shifts in your body. Maybe you'll notice back of your neck opening, your chest, your belly. It's okay if you don't, but just be curious. And then go ahead and open your eyes gently. Allow the images to flow into you. So you can look at the screen, you can look around the room, but don't look out. Let everything flow to you. And just notice how different that experience is. Now, this is a really, really simple exercise that any of us can do. And what's really powerful about this is not only that it relaxes our own nervous system and is sending messages of safety, right, to our brain, to our body, but it softens our face. It actually softens us. And so if you're next to anybody else, a person's body, what we call neuroception. So we have our perception, right? We perceive people and we take things in. Neuroception is happening just underneath our conscious awareness. So we're neurocepting people all of the time, right? So if I was talking or working in a really high-pitched, fast voice with my shoulders tense and my eyes bulging, like, people wouldn't feel very safe. And I probably, wouldn't get very good results in my work, because people are seeing and hearing and feeling that as a little bit threatening. Even though I'm not, it's perceived by the body to be that way. So if you're a caregiver, okay, and you want to bring something a little bit more relaxing to the ones with ALS, your loved ones or the ones you take care of, and feel better yourself, you spend a few moments relaxing your eyes, relaxing your brow, a slight smile on your face, and give yourself a few moments. And then you can walk into the room or turn towards whoever you're with, and the experience will be different. It'll be subtly different or maybe profoundly different. But what it's going to enable you to do is to connect more. And remember, connection is so important when there's been trauma. Connection is so important anyway. As human beings, as mammals, we need connection with one another. And we need to feel safe in connection. And this is one way we can facilitate a little bit more safety by relaxing the eyes with one another and being able to connect with ourselves. Another really simple exercise for connection, again using our imagination, is to tune in. We're going to do that right now. Just tune in again to your body. It's kind of self-reflecting, noticing what it's like. For some of you, it might be numb, you might not feel anything. For some, you might feel a lot, but you just notice, right? Just curious. And then just inquire, what would I need? What would I need to feel more connected? And just see what comes up. No right or wrong answer. It's your experience. What would I need to feel more connected? And if you get an answer, just acknowledge that within yourself. As adults, we don't always get what we need, but acknowledging the need itself gives us something. And it can settle us because we're acknowledging something within us. And then, of course, if we're able to express it to someone, that's even better. For instance, if it was a hug, I really need a hug, right? And we can get one. That's wonderful. If we can't, just the acknowledgement of that gives us something. Again, it's subtle, but it's important. And it's building a relationship with your body because you're inquiring. Now, something that often comes up when we have unresolved trauma is the feeling of being stuck. Okay? I hear it all the time. I feel stuck. And more often than not, feelings of being stuck come because emotions are stuck within us. Now, it might not feel that way. We might not feel emotions stuck. We just feel stuck in one way or another. I just feel stuck. I don't know what to do. I feel stuck. Again, more often than not, it's because we have emotions that we have not been able to express at some time in our life. Shock trauma, developmental trauma, both. And those emotions get trapped within us. And they're stuck. And so we have an experience of being stuck. And those emotions, as I say, get pushed down below conscious awareness. And so we don't know they're there. Or they come up now and again, right? In an explosion and give us a little bit of a fright, or they squid out and then we push them back down, or we get really scared of them and really try not to feel them. But this is what happens. Okay. So reflect for a moment on the last time or any time when you felt stuck. Okay, no right or wrong way, just see what comes up. The last time I felt stuck. And just notice. What that was like. And now let's shift that and reflect. When was the last time you felt in flow? When you came out of feeling stuck? Whether it was a flow of emotion, a flow of creative thought, a flow in relationship, a flow at work. When was the last time you felt unstuck and in flow? And notice what that's like in your bodily experience. Okay. So the exploration of emotions is really important to find what might be inside of us that is stuck. And of course, we don't want to feel all emotions all at once. We want a gentle inquiry and investigation into that, if you will. And we really don't want to be feeling all of our emotions if we've had a lot of trauma until we've developed more of a container or capacity in our body to feel them. Resolving emotions isn't about expressing them outwards. Sometimes that can be helpful, right? Imagining we're shouting or imagining we're angry. But more often than not, the resolving of an emotion, as you spoke about earlier, is to feel them in our body, and they have their moments in time, and then they dissolve and it's done. Okay? That can take a little practice. That can take a little relational work, meaning finding safety in a group, like we're going to have our book club, or with a therapist, or with one another, on how to gently touch in, more to our body to develop that capacity, which becomes our container to be able to feel more. Okay. I'm going to pause and ask James, or ask all of you if you have any questions, and ask James to maybe open up the mic of anyone who has a question. I believe there's a way you can raise your hand. Is that how you'd like to do it, James?
Yeah, I think that's a good way. If you want to go down to the bottom menu and pick the reactions and then pick the hand, and a hand will come up and you will move to the front of the line, and so we'll know that you have a question. And if you're unable to speak, you can also, and you have the ability to type or use voice activation, you can put something into chat, and I can read that for Julie as well. So yeah. So anyone have a question?
Julie, my question is this, because sometimes what I see, and maybe it could be the caregiver, maybe it could be a person living with ALS who is respectfully disconnected. And the struggles that I see when one person is just incredibly stuck or disconnected, where their heart is closed. Do you have any wisdom for that dynamic of how to engage with that? Because oftentimes that's what can create such tension and such difficulty.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Well, this is why I gave those couple of exercises with the eyes, because we can sit next to a person who's very disconnected and very stuck, and they're neurocepting others, right? And so if we're the one that is wanting to connect, our own connection in our nervous system and the softness of our face and the softness of our voice is in some way, sometimes it slowly begins to permeate the person who's greatly connected and greatly stuck. Remember, the nature of us as human beings is we want to connect. We need to connect, right? But it's painful to connect. And often underlying the disconnection is the risk it takes to connect is really scary, because what if, it's often in developmental trauma, what if I lose love again? Right? That might be a big stretch to get from A to B here of what I've just said, but the reason we're disconnected is really powerful, and we really need to respect that. People disconnect from their bodies and emotions for a reason, right? And this is why I say it's a gentle journey. It's not like, hey, get back into your body and feel that. It's impossible, but it's also cruel to try and do that. What is loving is a gentle way to reconnect, to inquire, you know. And for the person who wants to connect but feels so disconnected, a relationship, you know, we disconnect relationally, meaning even if there was a shock trauma and there was nobody there, you know, that was hurting us, to resolve that shock trauma, we really need to feel safe, and it's usually another person that helps us resolve it. Or if a person was there who was safe, that would help us to come back to safety and reconnect, and maybe not embed that trauma in our system. So trauma is usually about there wasn't another safe person available to help us reconnect. Did that answer the question for you, Ron, or do you want me to elaborate on a different piece?
Sure. And there's another question out there, but the one other piece that I would say is, you know, what I witnessed, the extraordinary fear of such a diagnosis, and I think the white elephant in the room for those living with ALS is mortality, the extreme fear that potentially shuts people down.
Yeah.
And for some, they don't know, maybe they don't have the capacity to navigate the trauma that's actually bubbled up or to recognize it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tremendous amount of fear. So it's frightening enough, right, to receive that diagnosis. It can be really scary. And you betcha all of us have unresolved fear in our past that we're carrying in our bodies, and that's going to come up as well. Remember, like a shock trauma or anything fearful can rattle our cages, if you will, and bring other fear up, and then we're twice as afraid and get twice as stuck or 3 times as stuck. So again, it's a gentle inquiry about the fear itself, right? And it might be asking a question, well, what comes up when you look at the fear? And the fear might be about dying, right? But then we keep inquiring into that, you know? So it's a gentle inquiry in what that is doing while being aware of the body if possible. And what that is doing is tapping into a person's own wisdom. And it's an invitation for that wisdom to begin to emerge through images or insight or thought that if we were just having an intellectual conversation about being scared of dying, we might not get to. But this gentle internal inquiry, including our imagination, or the imaginal realm, I call it, including our body, is going to give us access to our own wisdom and our own path and our own way of healing. Now, healing, as we know, doesn't mean curing a diagnosis. Doesn't mean it won't. But healing is something different. Right? So I've worked with people who've been tremendously scared, and before they did transition or die, they were at tremendous peace and there was no fear.
Yeah.
It's I want to say it's not easy, right? To be honest, it's not easy, but it's possible, and it opens us up to so much that without the diagnosis, we may not have discovered beforehand. That's what I hear a lot.
And what I can say to everyone is I've witnessed that where there was extreme fear, and along the way, people were able to let go of that fear and just transform in such extraordinary ways. In the chat, hold on a minute. Peter asked, what is the ultimate goal with being connected?
Well, it's a great question. It would be personal to each person. But what I would say, what happens, the more deeply a person connects with themselves, is they connect to themselves as love. You know, so we often talk about, I love myself or I don't love myself. But that in itself points to separation. So the deepest that I see and experience is love. And love isn't this separate individual entity. It's expansive and connecting. So we know ourselves as love. But also what connection does is connect us to something that's more than who we ordinarily may have thought we were. Meaning, people will come to me to work with trauma, I work in groups and so forth, and there's a certain amount of disconnection and a certain amount of contraction and a certain amount of tension in the bodies with this trauma, the result of trauma that's embedded within their body. And the healing process that begins to release, and maybe some of it's been with them their whole lives. And so they begin to know themselves in a way that they've never known themselves before. Or they begin to connect to aspects of themselves that had to split off in trauma. So often trauma is too much for us to bear, and we split parts of ourselves off, parts of our consciousness off. Remember, all of us have probably spoken about, well, part of me doesn't believe this, or part of me doesn't want to, or part of me thinks that. We're really speaking to elements of our unconsciousness that aren't connected to the whole. Right? They seem to be separate. And so we can have parts of ourselves that are very young, we can have parts of ourselves that are teenagers, adolescents, and so forth. And so reconnecting to ourselves is about finding and gathering these parts of ourselves that may not be in alignment to how we actually feel as an adult or could feel as an adult. Okay? We connect all of these parts of ourselves back into what we call a unified sense of wholeness. Right? So a person could say, wow, when I first started working with trauma, I would come and go out of different emotions. Sometimes I'd feel like I was a kid, sometimes isolated. There's all of these different parts of themselves, and they may not know quite who's going to show up or how they're going to react. The more deeply connected they are to themselves, the more unified they are, the more parts that they've integrated into themselves. Integration has to happen in the body. This is why the relationship with your body is so important. Right? ALS or no ALS, right? We need to integrate these aspects of ourselves into the body. And when we do so, we know ourselves more than we had before because there's more of us here in the moment as an adult. And when we have that, right, our heart is more open, it's easier for us to connect.
Okay. One more. What can help sustain a gentle connection to or with our body if living with ALS feels moment by moment like an intense experience of being betrayed by the body?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I would work on this experience of being betrayed by the body, like really inquiring into that, right? Is it the body that's betraying you, or is it the body has any less, right? And then working with then the relationship to the body, right? Maybe there's some anger, maybe there's some hatred, right? Maybe there's some grief, and being able to feel that and work with that gently and slowly over time to resolve that. And of course, it is intense. And so then that intensity and that feeling of betrayal makes us want to disconnect from the body more and more. Okay? So again, in the workbook that we're going to work with, and I'm in the book club, when we do this, I'm going to be very specific questions that come up around ALS. So I can be more specific with you and work a little bit more with you with these exercises.
Looks like there's another question in the chat. Did you want to read that, Ron? Wow, it's kind of
Go ahead, James.
quite a bit there. This might be a bit much for us to tackle right now, but I'll go ahead and read it, Julie, and you can see what you want to do here. Catherine is wondering, as a caregiver and daughter of a mother living with ALS, the fear of diagnosis was as traumatic as anything. I recall at the time of the looming diagnosis, after misdiagnosis initially, I was newly postpartum and nursing with a traumatic birth experience in which I survived a lethal onset syndrome, was fortunate to live through, and contemplating mortality from my own experience of body shutdown. So up all hours for months to sit and worry and swirl, that would pull me out of my body and away from my baby. Once I realized this was happening, I was able to transition and move that awareness back into my baby and my body and find comfort in the circular nature of this life, and that we all, especially my mother, Kathy, carry on with love and connection, and the fear lifted. The
Mm.
anticipatory anxiety of diagnosis and the ultimate adjustment to the diagnosis during that time was almost the worst part of this journey, almost 2 years later. We all feel better now, even living through and alongside the intensity of progression. I don't know what you might want to say about that, Julie, but there's a lot there.
Well, thank you for sharing that because it gives hope, right, of what you went through. But yeah, the diagnosis itself is very traumatic, right? And this is what we're speaking about, connection to one another. This is why Compassionate Care ALS is so, important and wonderful and offers so much on this journey because all the staff are so amazing at being able to connect. Connection is so vital. And what you just read, James, from this lady, I'm so glad you found your way to reconnect to your baby and to connect to yourself. Connection is paramount.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I'd like to say just a little bit about the book club. We'll be starting a week from tonight. You'll need to get a copy of Julie's book. I will send out, it's in the chat right now, the title of the book, which is the Body Awareness Workbook for Trauma by Dr. Julie Brown Yau. And then there's a registration link for the book club. We will be meeting 6 times over the next 12 weeks, so every other week. And you will receive assignments for how much to cover each week. And then when we get together, Julie will be joining us when she can. But if not, we will work together to help process the exercises. The book is a workbook, and it's just chock full of incredibly powerful exercises related to exploring all the things Julie's been talking about tonight, as well as many other things and many ways to develop resources and skills related to addressing our own trauma and being able to feel those feelings in the moment. And Julie, I don't know if you'd like to say more about that, but it should be a really wonderful time of connection and a chance to really go deeper with what we've begun to explore tonight. And there's no limit to how many can participate because we'll do breakout groups, so everyone will have a chance to do their own work with a partner or two. And so and connections outside of the circle will also be possible. So we really want this to be a strong container for everyone and an opportunity for everybody to do some deeper healing with their own trauma related to ALS or just in general. And as Julie said, things that may have happened long ago could suddenly become very important right now.
James, will some of our volunteers be involved with this?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
I believe so. Our staff will have some staff members as well. I'll be there, and other staff will be popping in when they can, and some may do the whole thing. So, this is just, as Ron said, it's become such an integral part of how CCALS approaches ALS, just understanding the impact that the trauma of the diagnosis and then all along the way, these traumatic experiences that can happen. So really important to have some notion of these ideas.
Yeah, and the way that I wrote the book is to begin to develop safety. So when you look through the book, you can see what might be pertinent to you. It's also available on audio for those who can't hold a book. So developing safety is fundamental when we work with trauma So there's exercises in the beginning of the book to do that. And then there's exercises on how to build an energetic boundary or boundaries. Because when there's been trauma, energetic boundaries get ruptured. So scientifically, we know, you all probably experienced it yourselves, we have an energetic boundary. We know when somebody gets too close, right? Or when we need to get closer, or when we're picking too many things up in our field. So when there's been trauma, our energetic boundaries get ruptured. And sometimes we can feel too sensitive. And the body doesn't feel safe. So when we build an energetic boundary, the body actually will begin to feel safer. And then when it feels safer, we're going to be able to connect to it a little bit more. And then there's exercises to learn how to reconnect with your body in a safe way, right? In a gentle and safe way. Begin to feel your body in ways that are going to be supportive of you. And then there's many self-regulation exercises. So self-regulation allows us to come back to our normal point of being. Everybody's point of being is different, if you will, and I mean how their nervous system is moment to moment. When we get overwhelmed or upset, right, or too much grief comes up, or we get a fright, but we need to be able to come back to our own center, right, our own homeostasis, if you will. And so the book has a lot of exercises to teach us how to do that. We need to be able to self-regulate when we get out of sorts, right? Now, self-regulation, just being able to come back to our own center, doesn't necessarily heal trauma, but it does help the nervous system lessen its vigilance. It helps us feel the body a little bit more, and it's going to help us build that relationship so we can embody and inhabit our bodies even more. And then there's a lot of exercises in there that work with the imagination. Right? So some of them, show you how to work with a loving being so you can feel connected and held. That's often really important. So many of us have a deficit of holding, and holding as a human being is so important. And the fact that we can use our imaginations and the body can feel like we are being held, maybe not 100% effect like we really were being held by someone, but we can imagine it and get some of that benefits into our body. So again, there's a whole range of exercises and explanations about trauma. And as we go through it in the book club, we'll be able to go deeper and deeper into your own experience. And as always, when there's a collective group and somebody asks a question, it tends to be a collective question. So obviously there won't be time for everybody to ask a question, but the questions that are asked hopefully will be able to, permeate out into the whole group. And then if there's an overload of questions, we'll see if we can collect them, James, and I can also read over them in between the meetings and be able to answer some of that as well.
Great. And also, there are 6 meetings over a 12-week period. But if you're out of town or for some reason missing a meeting, please don't feel like you can't participate. Just come as often as you can. And the main thing is to go through the workbook. It's self-directing, and to have the support to process as you go along with the group when you can.
I would like to encourage those of you who are interested to partake in this. One of the things I'm very, very proud of is, as an organization, the support that we're able to offer to our families, both individuals living with ALS and their significant others. Not only that, but that same support we offer to you and our community, we offer to our staff and our volunteers. Right? It's so incredibly important to inquire, self-inquiry. And, there's no right or wrong in regards to, did I do something right? Am I asking the right question, the wrong question? The experience all of you are in is extraordinarily sacred terrain. Really. And it's the bottom line, navigating something like ALS ultimately is obviously dealing with our mortality. So there's so much that can come up for those living with ALS, and again, for those who are caring for them. So, yeah, I really invite you, if you're drawn to this, and like James says, you don't have to be at every one if you can't make it, but it's just an opportunity. So I see it as just offering a gift. So,
Thank you, Ron.
yeah.
Julie, would you have any final thoughts before we close for tonight?
Well, again, I encourage everyone to take a look at the workbook. It's simply written and it explains a lot and can just give you a whole lot of information about yourself that you haven't had before and really help you out on the ALS journey. There's such a variety of exercises in there that you can go to again and again and notice the difference of yourself as you do them. So I really look forward to seeing many of you there. Those of you who are here tonight, those of you who are going to listen to the recording, I know a lot of people couldn't show up. And so we can do this as a group. We can discover and heal together. We're human beings. We need one another in times of difficulty and great challenges, for sure.
Thank you, Julie. Good night, everyone. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.